Have you ever been at a party or a networking event and you're telling a story to a couple of mates? You're getting right into it and you're absorbed in the yarn, and then you look up and you realise that everybody at the party is looking at you, listening. And in that crowd of people there are some real experts who know way more about what you're talking about than you do, along with a bunch of people who you can just tell are assuming that everything you're saying is the unvarnished gospel truth. But instead of 20 or 40 people at the party, there's 5,000. And with everyone staring at you, you decide to burst into song. That's what's about to happen to me. I recorded this episode back in January, back when the podcast was more of an idea than a reality, and maybe 20 people were listening. The response that the official launch got was quite frankly stunning, with thousands more downloads than we anticipated, and my inbox basically carked it from all the offers of help and questions. So while the bulk of the episode was, as I said, recorded weeks ago, I thought I'd do this little cold open to do a couple of things. First, thank our listeners, and second, to remind you all to read the discussion thread. So, thank you, and read the discussion thread. I've got some caveats in there that I should have mentioned in the first recording. Now, I guess a couple more things before we start. I didn't really know how to use my microphone settings properly when I first recorded this, and you will notice the audio quality change. Hopefully it's not too distracting. I am getting better, I swear. I've also recorded an appendix, which I've chucked on at the end, sort of going into a bit more detail and following down some tangents. So if you listen to the beta version of the episode, keep an ear out. And yes, the appendix does include a song. Anyway, enough from present me. Let's hear past me instead.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Oh, that sounds quite martial, doesn't it? Hello, everybody. My name is Taz Stacey, otherwise known as TasFromTas on Reddit. I will be your host this week, and my particular flair covers Reformed Protestantism and the history of Australia, particularly the history of Tasmania, which is the small island state off the southeast corner of the Australian continent. I had a bit of a dilemma because I'm really excited about podcasts, and when I heard the first episode that Art and Kellebreth did, I was like, yeah, I totally want to be in on this. Then I thought, is anyone actually interested in what I know about? Because really, the finer workings of the Westminster Confession of Faith, I struggle. Basically, I get to answer, maybe 4 questions every couple of years. So anyway, I thought I'd tell you a story of one of the more infamous, I guess, inhabitants of the island of Tasmania, Alexander Pearce, and he was a convict in the very late, in the early 1800s. Now, I hesitate to tell this story because it's a really common story that people tell when Tasmania. I mean, you've probably never heard of it. I'll just take my hipster glasses off. But anyway, you probably have never heard of it. But if you come to Tasmania, you'll almost certainly come across it. And so, in the same way that Africa is a lot more than swollen-bellied, starving children and ruthless warlords, Tasmania is a lot more than convicts and indigenous genocide. However, it's at least part convicts and genocide. And the other things that I know about, like the development of the superfine merino wool industry, or the first use of ether in surgery in the southern hemisphere, they're not really that interesting. So I'm going to tell this story. A warning: it's pretty disturbing. The details that I'm going to pass on were all fit for print in the newspapers of the day, so it's not safe for work in that aspect. But it's a horrible story. Most of my source material for this story comes from a couple of sources. One is Paul Collins, who wrote Hell's Gates, The Terrible Journey of Alexander Pearce. And the other primary sources I'm using are the Hobart Town Gazette, which was the newspaper of the day. And you can access them yourselves, if you like, through the National Library of Australia website, which is nla.gov.au. There's been a couple of films made in the last 10 years about this particular story, but I haven't watched them. So don't ask me. Why I haven't watched them? Well, gosh, because, it's hard enough reading about this stuff, whether you'd want to watch it. But anyway, so some context. The convicts experience... I guess I should explain. I will use the term Van Diemen's Land and Tasmania almost interchangeably. The island, when it was initially discovered, it was discovered by a Dutchman. And when I say discovered, I mean, of course, discovered by Europeans. It was discovered by a Dutchman called Abel Tasman in the 1600s, and he named it after the governor of Java at the time, Van Diemen. And so it was Van Diemen's Land, but then after a while they thought that's silly and they changed the name to Tasmania. But at the time of this story, it was still Van Diemen's Land. So I'll try and stick with that. But if I lapse into calling it Tasmania, you'll understand why. Anyway, the convict experience on Van Diemen's Land was really varied. Convicts came from they came from a wide range of backgrounds. Most of them were working class English and Irish, but there were some sort of, you'd almost class them middle class Irish who got caught up in the Republican movement and were exiled not exiled, were transported for political reasons. And the journey to Australia from the United Kingdom really varied as well. Most of the time you were uncomfortable, but your general fate was not really that different from the fare-paying free settlers who, were making the same trip. Of course, some convict ships had really terrible mortality rates. There was a couple that had, about 30% of the convicts dying during or shortly after the voyages finished. And if you're interested in convicts in general, I'd highly recommend The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes. And that's the sort of the classic work that you want to read if you're interested in convicts in Australia. But anyway, so life as a convict in Van Diemen's Land could take a few different paths. For most, you did your time, often working alongside a free farmer on his property, working as a shepherd or wheat farmer or something like that. You ate the same food, you weren't chained up, you did the same sort of work, perhaps even slept in the same house. It wasn't great. You were forcibly separated from your wife and kids back in England, almost never to see them again. But it wasn't as, a terrible fate as some. It certainly wasn't anything like the chattel slavery experienced in the Americas, really. If you followed orders and you were given enough food to eat, it was okay. Heaven help you if you decided you're sick of doing what you're told, though. Now, the death penalty was used during this point. So anyone found guilty of crimes like murder was simply hanged, but it's a mistake to think that they handed out the death penalty on the colonies, at least, really willy-nilly. They really reserved the death penalty for things like murder. Everything else you would get, there's a whole range of stuff. And they set up these special penal colonies for secondary punishment. So these were settlements that were set up to house convicts who had committed further crimes after their original sentencing. Under the thinking of the time, inmates of the two penal colonies in Van Diemen's Land, Port Arthur and Macquarie Harbour, they were the recidivist hard cases. They'd rejected the second chance at a law-abiding life, and they were the ones that really had to be cracked down on. So anyway, on to the subject of our story. Alexander Pearce was a Catholic Ulsterman sentenced to 7 years transportation for the theft of 6 pairs of shoes in 1819. Paul Collins posits that Pearce was most likely a professional thief and that this was not his first offence. I'm going to quote Paul Collins here on what happened once Pearce reached Van Diemen's Land. Pearce quickly distinguished himself as a troublesome malcontent. Between his arrival in Tasmania in February 1821 and early August 1822, when he was sent to Macquarie Harbour, he had absconded twice, received 4 floggings, one of 50 lashes for embezzling 2 turkeys and 3 ducks, one of 25 and another of 50 for being drunk and disorderly, and another 50 and 6 months working in chains for stealing a wheelbarrow. So this gives you sort of an idea, I guess, of what you had to do to get sent to one of the penal colonies. So after he was recaptured for absconding a 3rd time, he was sentenced to serve the remainder of his sentence on Sarah Island. So, we're looking at, he was essentially given a 5-year sentence on Sarah Island. Now, conditions on Sarah Island, Sarah Island's on Macquarie Harbour, which is on the remote west coast of Tasmania. Sarah Island is in Macquarie Harbour. So it gets confusing, but anyway, not that confusing really. I'm just bad at explaining it, eh? Conditions on Sarah Island were absolutely terrible, even by the standards of the day. It was only open for just over a decade, and when at least one prisoner during that time explicitly murdered another prisoner for the express purpose of attracting the death penalty rather than serving out his sentence. And when you realise that his sentence was probably, at that point maybe 3 years left, that tells you how bad it was. And this wasn't a death camp or anything like that. The point of these camps was to be a workstation for prisoners, just they would be under a lot closer watch. So their particular job was cutting down trees for shipbuilding. There's a particular type of pine tree that grows in that part of Tasmania that's in really, really high demand. Huon pine, actually, it was and is extremely valuable because it has these special oils in it that make it really resistant to rotting. So that's really, really valuable in shipbuilding. But yeah, so the west coast of Tasmania, which is where Macquarie Harbour and Sarah Island are, is very remote. And today it's the best example of cold climate rainforest left in the world. It's incredibly beautiful, but only if you're coming from the perspective of a tourist with, a full belly and dry clothes. It's incredibly rugged terrain with huge trees and really thick undergrowth, and pretty much cold, wet and dreary. It's a very difficult country to live in, even for the indigenous people of the island. The Palawa people in Tasmania tended to live along the much more hospitable east and north coasts. For convicts from an industrialised country, the place, even though it's super green and there's plenty of water, might as well have been a desert. There's just basically no food. And because the colony didn't produce any of its own food, dysentery and malnutrition the rates were really, really high. If you're ever in Australia and get a chance to come down to Tasmania, it's absolutely worth visiting the west coast, and you can still go and see some of the convict buildings. And Port Arthur is very much the best sort of preserved example of it. Sarah Island, not so much, but it's just incredible to see. However, I'll put up a bunch of photos in the discussion thread so you can see if you can't afford to fly across the globe. So I guess the main takeaway I want to get from that is the landscape is beautifully depressing. Imagine a jungle but cold, not freezing, but not too far above freezing either. So yes, as I said, Sarah Island is a small island in the middle of Macquarie Harbour. The security of the penal colony came from the fact that the harbour can only be entered by ship through a treacherous passage known as Hell's Gates. A lot of the convicts sentenced to Sarah Island drowned in transit, actually, and including the Marines and the prison guards who had to look after them. So getting posted to Sarah Island kind of sucked for the guards. And anyway, but apart from that, there wasn't like those huge big walls around the place. Mostly they just relied on the natural inhospitability of the surroundings, because where people were going to go? You're hundreds of kilometres from civilization, basically. And yes, so I mentioned that their main job was cutting down the pine trees in the area. So on September 20, 1822, Alexander Pearce and 7 other convicts were working on a particular chain gang on the Tasmanian mainland. So they'd gone by a little boat from Sarah Island onto the mainland and were cutting down trees. This group hatched a plan to escape. They only had one overseer, and they all had axes. So again, this gives you an idea of the sort of level of security that they were given. But they planned to escape, commandeer a whaleboat, and sail to freedom to an island in the Pacific, or perhaps even China. Now, when I first read this, I was like, yeah, come on, guys, as if you're going to be able to do that. But one of the convicts, Robert Greenhill, he was a sailor, and he had really good navigation skills. And this sort of stuff, you read about what Captain Bligh was able to do, and even a group from Sarah Island themselves, a group of 10 shipwrights, once stole a ship and managed to escape to Chile in South America. So maybe it wasn't as far-fetched as all that. But anyway, they easily overcame their single guard and ran off, but they never managed to get onto the whaleboat, and soon they switched to their plan B, which was to walk about 225 kilometres, which is about 140 miles in the imperial system, east to civilization. Now, 225 k's actually isn't that far to walk. If you're walking along a road, you might expect to walk that distance, in less than a week. And these were highly motivated men. But it should give you an idea of how rough the terrain was when you realise it took the survivor something like 8 weeks to walk out. So this is really rough terrain. And first they wandered for 8 days. Water was really plentiful, but for food, for people who don't know what they're looking for, there's none. Now at this point the group was super desperate, and they almost impulsively murdered and then ate one of their own members. Alexander Dalton was the first guy to die, and according to Pearce, mainly because he was unpopular, because in the past he volunteered to flog other inmates. He was sort of one of the the snitches in the prison system. But yes, so they murdered him with their axes and cooked and ate him. Now this is This is not usual behaviour even for the desperate convicts. And the group split up at this point, with a couple of the escapees sort of realising how the story is going to end and attempting to walk back to Macquarie Harbour. They made it to the coast, but they died of exhaustion shortly after, so no luck for those guys. And the main group continued to walk east for 5 weeks, led by Robert Greenhill's excellent navigation. And if I've walked through that country, I used to do a lot of bushwalking in the area, and it's incredible because it's so rough that a lot of the time you can't get high and see. You're just in the middle of this jungle, basically. And so he did a brilliant job of navigating by the stars. And they made it very close to settled lands, where the lands had been cleared and they had sheep farms and all the rest of it. But one by one, as they did this, the weakest men were ganged up on, murdered, usually in their sleep, and eaten by the rest of the group. Initially, they cooked the flesh, but pretty soon the group lost the ability to make fire, and so they ended up eating the flesh and innards just raw. And this is one of those scenes that I'm sure, in the movies that they've made about this, they sort of go into great detail, and this is largely why I don't want to watch them, because, gosh, who gets their kicks watching this sort of stuff? I don't know. And so Collins writes, but the problem with human flesh is that, while rich in protein, it never really satisfies hunger because of the lack of carbohydrates, which provide energy. That is why the men had to kill so regularly. No matter how much they ate their companions, it was not enough for the energy needed on their stamina-sapping journey. So eventually, we come down to 2 men remaining alive, the leader, Robert Greenhill, and our subject, Alexander Pearce. So they had, at this point, murdered and eaten 4 or 5 other convicts. They had 1 axe between them, and they played a dreadful game of cat and mouse for 8 days, refusing to sleep, because basically whoever went to sleep first was going to get murdered. But they still had to keep pushing east towards settled land, and they couldn't. They didn't have the energy to sort of fight it out while they were awake. So, because they were right at their tether. But at last, Greenhill fell asleep, and Pearce was able to grab the axe, kill, and eat him. And you get the impression that this was basically just before they escaped. So whether Pearce actually had to do that or not. Because the question I've always had is, why didn't Greenhill, while he had the axe, try and kill Pearce? And the impression that I get was because he thought that they were both going to make it, but Pearce had other ideas. And so shortly afterwards, after Pearce had killed and eaten Greenhill, he emerged into civilization and lived for a few months as a bushranger, stealing sheep and robbing farms, so living on the fringes of civilization. He was recaptured and taken to Hobart Town to be interrogated. And under interrogation, he confessed to the series of murders and cannibalism during his escape. And this is this is the incredible part of the story. They didn't believe him. They thought he was covering for his mates, who were probably still out there, living free and robbing people. And so they sent him back to Sarah Island to complete his sentence. And this really flies in the face, because I'd always had this idea of convict punishment being, routinely harsh. And if some guy had escaped a bunch of times and committed extra sort of highway robbery, I would have thought they'd hung him for sure. But no, they sent him back off to Sarah Island to complete his sentence. And so apparently he was a bit of a celebrity back on Sarah Island, and a few months later he escaped again, this time with a Thomas Cox in tow. Now, Cox was a young man who had pestered Pearce to take him away when he escaped, and so they bolted, and then very quickly it was discovered that Cox couldn't swim. And this made Pearce really, really angry, because basically that meant that Cox couldn't escape. And so he pestered him, come on, escape with me, while sort of he should have known that he couldn't actually escape. And so this put Pearce into a massive rage, and Pearce murdered Cox and ate him almost for the hell of it, because he wasn't actually that hungry, or hadn't been away from civilization for very long at that point. Now I'm going to switch now to a very lengthy reading of the Hobart Town Gazette. This was the newspaper of the day, and this is from the edition of the 25th of June 1824. The Supreme Court of Van Diemen's Land. Alexander Pearce, a convict, was arraigned for the murder of a fellow prisoner named Thomas Cox at or near Kings River in the month of November last, and he pleaded not guilty. The circumstances which were understood to have accompanied the above crime had long been considered with extreme horror. Reports had associated the prisoner with cannibals, and recollecting as we did the vampire legends of modern Greece, we confess that on this occasion our eyes glanced in fearfulness at the being who stood before a retributive judge, laden with a weight of human blood, and believed to have banqueted on human flesh. It was, therefore, with much satisfaction we heard His Majesty's Attorney-General, whilst candidly opening his case for prosecution, entreat the jury to dismiss from their minds all previous impressions against the prisoner, as, however justly their hearts must excoriate the fell enormities imputed to him, they should duteously judge him, not by rumours, but by indubitable evidence. The learned gentleman then proceeded to detail certain confessions made by the prisoner before the late much lamented Lieutenant Cuthbertson, Commandant at Macquarie Harbour, and at his examination by the Reverend Robert Knopwood, confessions which, although in some respects inconsistent, would yet, when coupled with all the facts, merit the most serious attention. From them it appeared that, as other evidence would prove, the prisoner and the deceased, on the 13th November, absconded from their duty in the woods, each of them taking his axe, and the prisoner being heavily ironed. That they for several days wandered on without provision and reduced by weakness, until on the following Sunday evening the deceased and prisoner arrived at Kings River. A quarrel then arose because the deceased could not swim, and after the prisoner had struck him on the head 3 times with his axe, the deceased, seeing him about to go away, his irons having been knocked off, said in a faint voice, "For mercy's sake, come back and put me out of my misery." Prisoner then struck him a 4th blow, which immediately caused death. He then cut a piece off one thigh, which he roasted and ate, and, after putting another piece in his pocket, he swam across the river, with an intent to reach Port Dalrymple. Just as a note, Port Dalrymple is about 300 kilometres away, so that was his plan, to walk about 300 kilometres. Soon afterwards, however, he became so overwhelmed with the agonies of remorse that he was constrained to recross the river, and, on seeing a schooner under way from the settlement, he made a signal fire, which, on being seen, induced the pilot boat to put off and take him on board. He was then conveyed to the harbour, where he publicly owned the murder, and said that he was willing to die for it. The Attorney-General concluded a thrilling tale of almost incredible barbarity by calling Thomas Smith, who swore that in November last he was coxswain to the Commandant at Macquarie Harbour. He knew the prisoner and the deceased. They absconded from Logan's gang on the 13th, and on the 22nd Pearce made his signal fire on the beach near Kings River, and was taken back to the settlement. He said Cox had died, and he had cut off a bit of his flesh to show what had become of him. Witness on the following day was ordered by the Commandant to go with the prisoner to get Cox's body. He went, and it was found. The head was away, the hands cut off, the bowels were torn out, and the greater parts of the breech and thighs gone, as were the calf of the legs, and the fleshy parts of the arms. Witness said to the prisoner, "How could you do such a deed as this?" He answered, "No person can tell what he will do when driven by hunger." Witness then said, "Where is the head?" The answer was, "I left it with the body." Witness searched for and found it a few yards off, under the shade of a fallen tree. Witness then picked up what appeared to be the liver of the deceased and an axe stained with blood, on which the prisoner was asked if that was the axe which he had killed Cox, and he answered it was. The fragments of the body were quite naked. Near them were some pieces of a shirt and the cover of a hat. There had been a fire near the body, and not far from it lay a knife, which Witness picked up. The body was then placed in 2 rugs, and Witness, with the prisoner, returned to the settlement. Prisoner, on being asked where Cox's hands were, said he had left them on a tree where the boat had landed. A search was then made for them, but they could not be found. Prisoner said he had cut off Cox's flesh to support him on his intended journey to Port Dalrymple, but when he had crossed the river, made a sign and gave himself up. William Evans of the Waterloo schooner had gone on shore to take the prisoner, who said Cox had drowned in Kings River. Prisoner's hands were fastened and his pockets searched, in one of them which was a piece of flesh, and he was asked what was this, and he said, "It is a piece of Cox, and I brought it to show that he is lost." Witness heard the Commandant say to the prisoner, "Tell me, Pearce, did you do the deed?" Prisoner answered, "Yes, and I am willing to die for it." Witness asked him why had he killed Cox. He said, "I'll tell no man until I'm going to suffer." Many other witnesses were then called who corroborated the above depositions at every essential point and proved that the clothes and hat worn by the deceased when he had absconded were those with the prisoner wore when he was taken on board the pilot boat, but that the hat covering had been taken off. The prisoner's written confessions were afterwards most fairly commented on by the Chief Justice, who addressed the jury at considerable length with much solemnity, and submitted to their consideration whether or no it was fully proved that the deceased had died from blows inflicted by the prisoner. And then, even if he had so died, whether, as a quarrel had been stated to have occurred before death, the prisoner was guilty of the crime charged, or of manslaughter. The jury retired for a short time and found a verdict of guilty. Okay, so that is a quote from the Hobart Town Gazette. There's a few interesting things. One is, this was of immense interest to the local media at the time. And after the guilty verdict, he was sentenced to death, and 30 days later he was hung. And part of the sentence, his body was ordered to be delivered to surgeons for dissection. This was unusual. Most convicts weren't dissected, but they thought that such an unusual criminal, they might be able to discover the reasons for his depravity post-mortem. He didn't look like a barbarous cannibal. He was very short. He was, I think, 5'1" or 5'2", which is very short even for the day. So they wanted to find out why. So yes, I'm pretty sure they took his head and poked around at his brain a lot. So that is the story of the convict cannibal Alexander Pearce. Now I'm going to start talking about a couple of other things that were related, I guess, tangentially to that story of Alexander Pearce. They're interesting topics, but they're not really worth an episode of their own. The exploits of Alexander Pearce were enormously influential to the Tasmanian Gothic literary genre. I'm serious, Google Tasmanian Gothic, it's an actual thing. It's a distinct genre of films, books and plays that sprung up merging Victorian Gothic themes with the Tasmanian landscape and institutions. Tasmania provides a real mix of sort of fantastic primal wilderness, brutal penal settlements, insane asylums, depraved and degenerate criminals, remote insular communities of feral, inbred trappers and hill farmers, mysterious and ancient tribal peoples, almost impossibly weird animals, and of course visiting gentlefolk from Victorian England, there to record it all in their journals. As I'm talking about this, the gamer in me is immediately recognising this is an awesome setting. As I mentioned earlier in the cast, Tasmania is a lot more than this, but this is what we are quote unquote famous for. Tasmanian Gothic is a reasonably active genre, with at least a couple of books and films being published every decade. American listeners should be able to fairly easily get a hold of The Hunter, which is a 2011 film starring Willem Dafoe and Sam Neill, the guy from Jurassic Park. The film tells the story of a hunter contracted to find and destroy the last Tasmanian tiger, or thylacine to use the Latin name. The Tasmanian tiger is a Tasmanian marsupial thought to be extinct since the 1930s. It looks like a dog with tiger stripes, but it carries its young and it pouts like a kangaroo. Anyway, so while The Hunter is it's still a dark, confronting film, it's probably not going to make you vomit like the recent films about Alexander Pearce probably would. Actually, we've got Valentine's Day coming up, so it's not a bad choice actually for a date movie if you're wanting something beyond rom-coms. But anyway, of course, everyone's watching the Olympics, eh? Go Aussie. For the Term of His Natural Life is a book by Marcus Clarke, published between 1870 and 1874. This is the best example of the Tasmanian Gothic genre. It is to the Tasmanian convict experience what Moby Dick is to Atlantic whaling. It's a novel that mixes fictional characters with real places, authentic situations, and a real ripping yarn. In the novel, the hero of the story is a Victorian gentleman falsely accused of murder, and he ends up being transported to Van Diemen's Land. He's a real tragic hero, and it's sort of quite often his personal honour and ethics that keep him trapped in his dreadful circumstances. He moves between Sarah Island and Port Arthur and Van Diemen's Land, and there's a few plot elements that were taken directly from the events surrounding Alexander Pearce. The novel really explores the systemic violence and injustice that was part of the convict's experience for so many people. Without spoiling things too much, the ending of the book always gives me massive sads. Actually, the author had to write several significantly different endings. There was the original ending for the serial publication in 1872. Then he wrote a book. that was published in 1874, and then he had to rewrite it for US audiences when the story was published in the United States. The book ending, the one in the middle, does sort of fit the rest of the story very well, and I guess this is, I guess it's the canonical ending of the story. Anyway, it's really worth a read if you like old historical fiction and or being outraged. You can find the book in the public domain, and I'll link it in the discussion thread. Now I'm going to finish this episode with a song, literally. I really wanted to feature some of the folk songs about transportation to Van Diemen's Land on this cast. But of course, getting a copyright permission is such a pain in the proverbial. I would have really liked to play some tracks by Still I Stand or Dominic Behan. So the song I most wanted to play on the cast is called Van Diemen's Land. Not the U2 one on Off Rattle and Hum, but this is an actual sort of traditional song about a poacher who was transported. There are a number of different versions of lyrics floating around, which is not unusual for old folk songs. And as near as we can tell, the song was written very early in the 1800s and is set to a much older Irish or English tune. I found a great set of lyrics actually in the Launceston Advertiser in an 1829 edition, I think. So the Launceston Advertiser is a local Tasmanian newspaper at the time. The actual newspaper article is really, really snarky about the lyrics, sort of blatantly saying that the convicts didn't have it nearly so bad as the song makes out. And obviously, the author of the song hadn't read any of the recent submissions to a parliamentary inquiry on convict transportation, which clearly laid out that transportation had long ceased being a punishment at all. Now, there is a large element of truth to this, as sort of at the time, and but of course, the Free Settler editor of the Advertiser, he would say that, wouldn't he? He was never transported himself. And undoubtedly, the convict experience was extremely traumatic for thousands of people, especially in the first decade or so of transportation. Anyway, I couldn't find any recordings at all of these particular lyrics, so I'm going to give it a crack and do it myself. Thought about putting down some banjo and harmonica and stuff, but I think the song works better as an a cappella lament. Also, that's easier. So if you don't care to hear me sing, feel free to skip on now, and we'll see you next episode. No hard feelings. Remember to check out the discussion thread and leave your comments and feedback and ask any follow-up questions you've got. And as always, visit us at AskHistorians.reddit.com. Cheers. They chain us 2 by 2 and whip and lash along. They cut off our provisions if we do the least thing wrong. They march us in the burning sun until our feet are sore. So hard's our lot, now we are got upon Van Diemen's shore. We labour hard from morn to night until our bones do ache. Then every one they must obey, their mouldy beds must make. We often wish when we lay down we ne'er may rise no more, to meet our savage governors upon Van Diemen's shore. Every night when I lay down I wash my straw with tears, while wind upon that horrid shore do whistle in our ears. Those dreadful beasts upon that land around our cots do roar. Most dismal is our doom upon Van Diemen's shore. Come all young men and maidens, do bad company forsake. If tongue can tell our overthrow, it make your heart to ache. You girls, I pray, be ruled by me, your wicked ways give o'er. For fear like us you spend your days upon Van Diemen's shore.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.